To tell you the tale of Macondo, I must take you back to the very beginning, to a time when it existed only as a dream in the mind of a stubborn man named José Arcadio Buendía. It was a dream of a city of mirrors, a vibrant city unheard of before. This city, which he named Macondo, was not merely a place. It was a world unto itself, a world brimming with wonders and secrets, a world that blurred the lines between reality and fantasy, between history and legend. The Buendía family, who founded Macondo, was no ordinary family. They carried within them a curse and a destiny that echoed through generations, a destiny of love and betrayal, of solitude and death. José Arcadio Buendía, the city's founder, was a man of wild imagination and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. His curiosity led him to discoveries and inventions, but it also led him down a path of madness and isolation. His wife, Ursula Iguaran, was a strong and wise woman, the backbone of the family and the community, bearing the responsibility of keeping them together in the face of hardships and challenges. Generations passed in Macondo for the Buendía family, and the city witnessed growth and prosperity, then decline and ruin, in a recurring historical cycle. The lives of the family members intertwined with the strange and supernatural events that occurred in Macondo, such as the appearance of ghosts, unusual weather phenomena, and the repetition of behavioral patterns across generations. The story of Macondo is the story of 100 years of solitude, the story of a family that tried to create its own world, but ultimately found itself trapped by its own isolation and destiny. This is the beginning of the tale of Macondo and the Buendía family, a tale I will tell you in detail, era after era, the founding and the first isolation. I remember well when it all began. There was only a dream in José Arcadio Buendía's head, a dream of a city of mirrors, a city whose name he didn't yet know, Macondo. It was a strange dream, but it completely consumed him. José was a stubborn man, with a boundless imagination and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. He fled his village with his wife, Ursula Iguaran, his cousin, after a tragic incident, his killing of a man in a duel to defend his honor. Their search for a new life led them across mountains and swamps, seeking a place to build a new future. After an arduous journey, they arrived at a secluded plain near a river with enormous white stones. There, beneath dense trees, José decided to build his city, Macondo. The beginnings were not easy. It was a matter of simple huts of reeds and mud, a primitive life full of hard work. The first inhabitants had to struggle to survive, to learn how to cultivate the land and hunt animals. Ursula, with her unwavering determination, was the true force behind the building of Macondo. While José was preoccupied with his strange ideas and his endless inventions, she managed the household, cared for the children, and kept the small community together. Ursula was a strong and wise woman who knew how to make difficult decisions and how to maintain hope in the face of challenges. Macondo at that time was completely isolated from the outside world, surrounded by swamps and dense forests. There was no contact with the world, except for occasional visits from bands of gypsies who brought with them strange inventions and news from faraway places. The gypsies were Macondo's only window to the world. They brought magnets, compasses, and telescopes, things that seemed like magic to the inhabitants of Macondo. That period was like Macondo's childhood, a period of innocence and isolation, a period in which a world of their own was formed, a magical and strange world, a world that had not yet known major conflicts and challenges. It was a period of building dreams and founding a new community, a period in which the foundation was laid for what would later come to pass. That first isolation was like a chrysalis that protected Macondo from the influences of the outside world, but it also sowed the seeds of internal isolation that would accompany the family and the city through generations. Discoveries and inventions. After those humble beginnings in Macondo, where life was simple and isolated, the winds of change began to blow over the small town. This change was not the result of an external invasion or a force coming from afar, but rather the creation of one man's curiosity, José Arcadio Buendía. He was a man tirelessly searching for knowledge. His passion for discoveries and inventions was unmatched, as if he were trying to decipher the codes of the universe with simple tools and a brilliant mind. I remember well when the gypsies first arrived in Macondo, bringing with them strange and wonderful things we had never seen before. A huge magnet that attracted everything made of iron, a compass that always pointed north, and a telescope that allowed one to see the stars as if they were just steps away. These objects were like true magic for the inhabitants of Macondo, who had never witnessed such wonders. These inventions completely captivated José Arcadio's mind. He became obsessed with understanding how they worked and how they could be used to improve the lives of the people of Macondo. He spent days and nights in endless experiments, forgetting everything around him, even his wife Ursula and his children. He believed that knowledge was the key to progress, and that Macondo should be at the forefront of the world. I remember how he tried to use the magnet to search for gold in the earth, how he tried to understand the movement of the stars through the telescope, and how he tried to build a flying machine inspired by the gypsies' description of a flying carpet. But this obsession led him to a kind of isolation. He isolated himself from his family and from reality, immersed in his own world of experiments and ideas. Ursula began to worry about him. He had become strange, talking about things no one understood, as if he were living in another world. Nevertheless, Ursula did not lose her patience, but tried as much as possible to maintain the cohesion of the family and manage the affairs of the household and the community. During this period, other characters began to emerge in the family, characters who would play an important role in the history of Macondo. Aureliano, José and Ursula's second son, was born a quiet and withdrawn child, with a piercing gaze, as if he saw what others could not. The signs of destiny also began to appear on this family, signs that would accompany them through generations, signs of love, betrayal, isolation, and death. Some disagreements also began to appear between family members, and the seeds of the conflicts that would later erupt were sown. José Arcadio the son, the eldest son, was characterized by a strong and reckless personality, while Aureliano was more calm and contemplative. A strange relationship also began to develop between Ursula and her daughter Amaranta, a relationship full of rivalry and jealousy. The period of discoveries and inventions was like Macondo's adolescence, a period of self-discovery and experimentation, a period in which the first signs of change began to appear, and in which the features of the town's and the family's future began to take shape. It was not just a period of inventions, but a period of profound transformations that would affect everything later. This period paved the way for the wars and conflicts that would follow. For José Arcadio's curiosity opened the door to a new world for Macondo, a world full of possibilities and dangers at the same time. This curiosity, which began with the innocence of discovery, would lead Macondo to sharp turns that would change its course forever. After the period of discoveries and inventions, which opened Macondo to a new world of knowledge and changes, the town entered a more turbulent and violent phase, the era of the civil wars. Macondo was not immune to the conflicts that were tearing the country apart, and it soon found itself embroiled in the heart of these wars. I remember well how things began to change, how news of conflicts between liberals and conservatives began to arrive, and how the sound of drums began to beat, heralding war. Aureliano Buendía, the second son of José Arcadio and Ursula, was not one to stand idly by in the face of these events. That quiet and withdrawn child, with his piercing gaze, transformed into a renowned military leader, who led many battles and fought countless wars. Aureliano joined the ranks of the liberals, leading revolts against them. The war was a harsh test for Macondo and its inhabitants, bringing with it death, destruction, and suffering. People's lives changed, and war became a part of their daily routine. I remember how the women waited for their husbands and sons to return from the war, and how tears and sorrows hung over the town. The war was not just a conflict between liberals and conservatives, but also a conflict between brothers and friends, a conflict that tore the community apart and created deep divisions. Macondo witnessed periods of siege, bombardment, and famine, and lost many of its sons on the battlefields. During this period, Ursula's true strength began to emerge. She became the driving force of Macondo, maintaining the cohesion of the family and the community in the face of hardship. She managed the affairs of the town with wisdom and rationality, helping the needy and alleviating the suffering of the people. Ursula was like a safety valve for Macondo during that difficult time. The war was like Macondo's coming of age, a period in which it learned the meaning of loss and pain, a period in which its true identity began to take shape. But the war also left deep wounds in the souls of the people of Macondo, wounds that would affect its future. These wounds were not only physical, but also psychological and social, wounds that would continue to affect future generations. I remember how Aureliano would return from the war from time to time, a different man, a man carrying on his shoulders the burdens and horrors of war. He was no longer that quiet child, but had become a harsh and hardened man, but one who also carried a deep wound in his heart. The boom and the beginnings of decline. After the long and bitter years of civil war, a cautious calm settled over Macondo, like the calm before a storm. But this time, the storm was not coming from the battlefields, but rather on board a train carrying promises of progress and prosperity. I remember that day well, when the first train arrived in Macondo. It was a historic day, a day that changed the face of the town forever. The railway line arrived, connecting Macondo to the outside world, the world from which it had been isolated for decades. Trade began to flourish, and the population increased significantly. People flocked from all over to Macondo, seeking new opportunities and a better life. Macondo seemed to be living its golden age, a period of prosperity and openness to the world. New companies emerged, shops and factories opened, and money began to flow into the town. Signs of luxury and extravagance also began to appear, and people began to enjoy a life they had never known before. But this openness also brought new problems, problems that had not existed before. Signs of corruption and moral decay began to appear, and old values began to fade. I remember how social relationships began to change, and how people began to care more about appearances than substance. Complex love stories also began to emerge, love stories that ended in failure, disappointment, and betrayal. Class conflicts also began to appear, between the newly rich and the poor who did not benefit from this prosperity. During this period, the character of Meme Buendía, Aureliano's daughter, began to emerge. She fell in love with Mauricio Babylonia, a mechanic. Their love story was one of the most poignant in the history of Macondo, a love story that ended in tragedy. The period of boom and openness was like Macondo's youth, a period full of vitality and energy, but also a period full of dangers and challenges. The first signs of decline also began to appear, the harbingers of the end, for that apparent prosperity hid behind it deep corruption and a deterioration of values. The arrival of the train was not just a passing event, but a crucial turning point in Macondo's history. After connecting it to the outside world, it also brought with it social and cultural diseases that it had never known before. This openness, which at first seemed like a blessing, eventually turned into a curse. The final isolation and the end. After the years of false prosperity and openness, Macondo began to feel the weight of the past. as if a curse were haunting it. Isolation returned to loom over the city, but this time it was not a geographical isolation as in the beginning, but an internal isolation, an isolation in the souls, an isolation between the family members themselves. I remember how relationships began to deteriorate, and how people began to feel bored and lost. That brilliance that once distinguished Macondo was no longer there. The city had lost its magic and appeal. Strange diseases began to appear, and death began to claim more lives, as if Macondo were paying the price for the sins of the past. The prophecy written on the ancient parchments began to come true, those parchments that Aureliano Babylonia finally read, revealing the fate of the family and the city. The prophecy spoke of the end of the Buendía lineage and the end of Macondo, an inevitable end with no escape. I remember how the family members began to live in complete isolation, each of them living in his own world, unable to communicate or understand. They became prisoners of the memories and mistakes of the past, unable to move forward. Patterns of behavior were repeated across generations, as if history were tragically repeating itself. In the end, a violent storm swept over Macondo, a storm unlike any seen before. The storm erased everything. Nothing remained of Macondo but memories and ruins. The story of the Buendía family ended, and the story of Macondo ended, a story of 100 years of solitude, the story of a city born from a dream and ended in oblivion. It was a tragic end, but it was also a logical end, for isolation and self-seclusion lead only to destruction. The story of Macondo is a lesson for generations, a lesson about the importance of communication and interaction with the world, and about the danger of self-seclusion and detachment from reality. Despite the tragic ending, the story of Macondo remains immortal, told to future generations, as a testament to the power of imagination and man's ability to build his own worlds, and as a warning against the perils of isolation and seclusion. Thus, the story of Macondo and the Buendía family came to an end, a story that began with a dream and ended with a storm that swept everything away. 100 years of solitude, 100 years of love, betrayal, and death, 100 years of searching for self and identity. Macondo was not just a fictional town, but a symbol of human isolation, the absurdity of existence, and the repetition of history. We learn from this story that isolation and self-seclusion lead only to destruction, and that communication and interaction with the world are the only path to salvation. We also learn that history repeats itself, and that the mistakes of the past should be lessons for the future. Macondo and the Buendía family will remain immortal in memory as a lesson for generations, reminding us of the importance of love, communication, and forgiveness, and of the dangers of isolation and despair,